I got to ask you about the Kennedy assassination. You wrote a famous book on it, Case Closed. I saw the Oliver Stone revamped documentary that he did, Through the Looking Glass. I thought he made a pretty compelling case. Now, obviously, it's my first time looking into this, about how this whole magic bullet theory that he clings on to, and other people who also doubt that there was a single shooter of the Kennedy assassination. They think it's a conspiracy theory, basically, that the first shot was a miss, the third shot hit the back of the head, and then there's a second shot, and that's what they call the magic bullet, which somehow went through his back, then hit the governor of Texas in front of him, and his back, then his lung, then his wrist. And they say that's just impossible. So therefore, there must have been more than 3 shots. Therefore, there must have been a second shooter. What do you make of that argument?
Yeah, I mean, they're absolutely right that if there's 4 shots, there's a conspiracy. And you've got a conspiracy, then you have to find what it is. And I would have liked to have spent a couple of years on the Kennedy assassination and returned to the absolutely credible evidence of a conspiracy, because I would have sold a lot more books than concluding that Oswald did it in the end. What I concluded about the so-called magic bullet is that it required no magic at all in the end for this reason. It turns out that, and it's not based upon me supposing that's the case or wishing it was so or saying, oh, I think so. From 1993 and on, pretty much, ballistics have changed enough that ballistics experts can now take 2 bodies the size and weight of the governor of Texas and Kennedy and put them in the same position they were at the moment that bullet strikes, which we know when that is by the frame of the Zapruder film, frame 223, 224. The Zapruder film, which is a home movie, the assassination acts as a time clock for the assassination, 18.3 frames per second. So you know now the 18th of a second in which the bullet hits. You have Kennedy and Connally in that position. You have this 165 grain, fully metal jacketed bullet, wartime bullet, hitting the president in the high neck, sort of shoulder area, passing through his neck without hitting any bone, going into Connally and tumbling at that moment. And so it's hit something, it's hit Kennedy. Why do I say tumbling? Because the entrance wound on Connally's back is 1.25 inches, which is the size actually of the bullet. It comes through, breaks his rib on his left chest as he's turning around holding his Stetson hat, and comes out ripping under his nipple and then into his wrist. It goes through the wrist, shatters the wrist, into the thigh. Now, you say to me, and I think right away, and I'm not a big shooter, okay, not a big gun guy, that means the bullet has to be in smithereens. Because the Warren Commission had the FBI try to reconstruct the test. They shot a bullet like that into pig carcasses, and the bullet came out all mangled up. So you say, well, of course, then that bullet couldn't have been the one on the stretcher, because that bullet on the stretcher is only flattened on one side. It's almost pristine. Okay, so now today they repeat that experiment all day long, and they understand why that bullet's in that condition, because it slows up as it hits the 2 men. It hits Kennedy about 1,500 feet a second, fired from Oswald's gun, or the assassin's gun. Let's not say Oswald to get anybody crazy. It's fired from the assassin's gun at 2,000 feet a second, hits Kennedy at 1,500 feet a second, thereabouts. It exits and goes into Connally at about 1,300 feet. When it exits, it hits Connally's wrist. It's traveling 900 feet, and you send that through the equivalent of wrist bones at 900 feet all day long. It's going to come out in the same condition you see that magic bullet in. So the real question is this. If that shot took place, forget whether it was Oswald, somebody firing from behind fired that bullet, which I believe was the second shot. The first shot missed. The Warren Commission got it wrong. The Warren Commission got a lot of things wrong. If that happened, no matter who the assassin is from behind, the real magic bullet that day happened to be the so-called front shooter, the grassy knoll shooter, because that shooter fouled the shot closer to Kennedy than any shooter from behind. And the grassy knoll shooter not only missed Kennedy, because the bullet shattered out the front of his head, but that shooter missed Mrs. Kennedy and missed the governor and Mrs. Kennedy and missed the Secret Service, missed the people standing on the other side. That bullet, there's been no remnants found of. And the interesting thing about that particular bullet, when I watched the Zapruder film, I'm convinced when I first watched it that Kennedy shot from the front. It looks like that way to all of us. You see him sitting in the car. He goes back. We've all seen 1,000 different films. You get shot from the front, you go backwards. Big open up cloud. When you watch it on digital stills, it's not very nice, but you get to see the president's head sort of explode out the front as this bullet enters the high rear portion, 1.25 inches higher. He misses Kennedy's head entirely, comes out the front of his head and blows out brain and blood matter, unfortunately, about almost a third of the brain. And the 2 police officers who were driving behind the limo, they were splattered with blood. I used to think that's because the bullet came from the front and splattered with them with blood. People watch the Zapruder frame, slow motion frame by frame. They will see those 2 Dallas policemen drive right into the blood splatter as it goes up in the air in this cloud of mist. So I think, I'm just keeping an eye on the, watch for one thing, that people spend too much time at Dealey Plaza on the ballistics. And here's what I mean by that. I'm convinced that the credible evidence shows me, and the ballistic evidence, that Oswald, forget Oswald, that Kennedy was killed that day by a shooter firing from behind the president. in the general vicinity where Oswald was left half an hour before the assassination. Now, if that's right, might be 5 assassins. There could be a conspiracy, but the only one of the assassins who worked that day was shooting from behind. Then the question is it Oswald or somebody else? Even if you conclude it's Oswald who's doing the shooting, which I do, you can argue with that, then the question is, did he do it for himself or for somebody else? Was he part of a conspiracy for the mob, the CIA? Did the CIA know about it? So if I was arguing a conspiracy, I'd focus on Oswald's connections, and people do, and what people knew, because I view him as the shooter. But people get quagmired into the single bullet and the questions of the headshot, and they don't get to the larger issues. They get stuck on the ballistics, and that would be important if you can't resolve them, but I think you can resolve them, even if the answer isn't one that most people find very satisfactory.